Hey there, folks. Thanks for tuning in to the Speaker Builder channel. And today I'm talking about driver alignment, and I want to explore the issues of vented versus sealed alignments. We want to try to understand all that so that we can make a good choice when it comes to our drivers. So first of all, we're talking about placing of a driver into a box. And the word alignment means an aligning of the various physical and electrical properties of the driver with the physical characteristics of the box. There must be an alignment of the two. And there are the two strategies, again, we're going to talk about are sealed, in which it's a simple sealed box like this one, or vented, in which the system utilizes a vent like this here. Now, we're only talking about the needs of mid-range drivers and bass drivers. High-frequency drivers, tweeters, are sealed in the back, and they have their own, oftentimes they'll have their own chamber for support. So they kind of are in a box, but they're in their own separate chamber. They can actually be mounted on top of a box. They don't even need to be inside a box. But they don't need a box. They come with their own box, as it were. But mid-range drivers and bass drivers must be mounted in a box, first to hang on to them, to place them in the room. But second of all, because drivers are producing waves in the back of the driver as well as the front. And in fact, a driver will produce an opposite wave in the back as the wave in the front. So as this driver operates, as it moves in and out, it will produce a positive wave out here, but at the same time producing a negative wave in back. Conversely, when it produces a negative wave in front, it produces a positive wave in back. And what will happen, the positive wave on the other side will simply come around and cancel out the negative wave, and you will get no effective wave motion on the air into the listening area. And so we don't want that cancellation, of course. We need to isolate the front wave from the back wave. And so we put the driver on a panel, on a baffle, and if the baffle is very, very long on all four sides, then you can isolate that front wave from the back wave. Now, if you make it infinitely large, one of the ways to do that is to put inside a sealed box, and the sealed box functions as an infinite baffle, and that's so boxes have been called infinite baffles for that reason. So the sealed box, of course, completely isolates the back wave from the front wave. So now you get effective production of sound waves in the listening space without any cancellation going on. So that's the whole point of putting a driver in a box. So now there are multiple strategies for getting the driver to work with the box to get the proper frequency response. Now, we're only talking about the low frequencies. There are some effects the box produces on the mid and high frequencies as it acts, those frequencies inside the box act against the cone. But that's another matter. What we're only talking about today is managing the low-end response of the bass and the mid driver. And so the box is going to help to do that, because otherwise a driver might drop off at a certain point. We can actually get a lower point before the drop-off if by putting this driver in a box and getting the box parameters and the driver parameters working together for that. Now, there are a multitude of strategies that have been utilized to get the driver to produce low frequencies all the way down to a certain point and to get certain kinds of bass characteristics out of the driver. And the two most common that we are talking about today are sealed and vented. And so we're going to be talking about those two only. Now, the other kinds, I'll just list a couple of those. One of them is called transmission line. There's quarter wave transmission line, which is another interesting hybrid of the transmission line design. There's passive radiators, not uncommon. In order to have a passive radiator design, you must have the driver manufacturer must produce the radiator. So you'll see drivers, and they will have a companion passive radiator, and you put the driver in, and then you put the passive radiator in another place in the box, and the two work back and forth in conjunction. And that system will also dictate the box size and all. But that would be fundamentally a sealed system, but with the passive radiator operating as kind of a vent. And then what else? There's a couple other different kinds of design. There's one I've just been recently told about. You put two drivers in a box, and each driver is out of phase 180 degrees, and they're at opposite sides of the box, and they produce waves like this. So as the positive wave comes out, it produces negative wave in the back of the box. And you have no pressure waves inside the box. The pressure remains relatively the same inside the box. Very interesting kind of a design. I haven't played with that. I want to try to fool with that at some point. But we're only going to be talking again about sealed versus vented. And part of the reason for that is simplicity. A sealed box, a sealed system is very simple. It's simply a sealed box, and whatever shape or size it might be, but it's sealed internally. So there's no vents or anything. No way for the air to escape. You actually put sealant, if you will, or there are sometimes rubber gaskets that our drivers have to seal that. And the other type, of course, is a vented alignment that utilizes a port. Oftentimes, the hole has a port in it, and the port, in this case, has a taper to it. So that's a flared port, and we're going to use these for these drivers here. So there's sealed and vented alignments. Those are the two we're going to be chatting about today. Now, most manufacturers will produce parameters for their drivers, and if they don't, well, I'm in trouble. I have a hard time buying a driver that doesn't produce the parameters for both sealed and vented alignments. Most of the drivers on especially the base drivers on Parts Express will offer both a sealed and a vented. Unfortunately, when they offer a vented alignment, they give you the box internal volume size only. They don't give you the vent diameter or length. This is a port with a certain diameter and certain length for this driver. So we need to know that in order to properly make that driver work. And so again, the simple parameters for a sealed alignment are simply the internal volume of the box. And for the vented alignment, it's both the internal volume of the box and the diameter of the port and the length of the port. Some driver manufacturers will themselves publish that information, and you can go on the driver manufacturer's website, look up the driver, and get that information. Other times, they won't provide it, but the supplier may provide it. When I shop at Matasound, if they don't publish it on their page that advertises their driver, you can call or email them and they will provide you either a vented or a sealed alignment. Another reason for using then, of course, sealed or vented alignment, for choosing between those, is because they're so readily available. I know of no parameters for producing a transmission line, or except for the passive radiator I mentioned earlier, or quarter wave transmission line, or some of these other designs. They probably have certain internal volume requirements and so forth that I don't see any publications on that stuff. So again, it's not only simple, the sealed versus vented. These two types are simple, but they're also readily available. So when you check the parameters of a particular driver that you purchase, if you find a sealed alignment, they will dictate the internal volume of the box that it must go in. So that's very simple. And oftentimes, not only are you producing a sealed box of that internal volume size, you're putting dampening. Some of the sealed alignments require this stuffing. It's Dacron or other kinds of fill, and you put it inside the box. It might call for 50% filling, and so you get almost 50% of that internal volume is taken up by this polyfill or other kinds of damping material. In this case, it's not required for this driver, and so but I did put some foam in the insides. It's actually carpet padding that I put inside that box. You want to align the inner panels with some soft material of some kind. And with the vented alignment, of course, they're going to give you both a internal volume, and they're going to give you the parameters for the vent, how large the diameter of the vent must be and how long that must be. And if you don't get those, I can't use that driver for a vented alignment. I'm surprised that folks will publish drivers, advertise them, and provide a vented alignment and only give you the internal volume and not give you the vent parameters. That's pretty useless, of course. You've got to put a vent in it. So let's talk effectively about what the difference is in the response curve we're going to just talk about sealed versus vented generally first. So I produced a little graph here to show you the differences in frequency response of a sealed versus a vented alignment. Now, this is only for the base driver. I'm going to talk a little bit later about sealed versus vented for a mid-range driver. But now, just for a base driver, for this 10-inch driver that we've seen on my table here, if I use a sealed alignment, I'm going to get a 3 dB down point, minus 3 dB, relative to flat zero response, at about 50 cycles. And then it's going to drop below that. So it's already 3 dB down at 50 cycles, and then it's going to drop below that. Now, why would that be important? Well, as I learned, the piano, the low bass, the lowest note in a piano, the low A, is at 27.5 cycles. It's way down here. I don't want that, my system having dropped way, way off at that point. Conversely, the low B on a 5-string bass is at 31 cycles down here. So I don't want a system that's dropping off considerably when I want to hear those notes. And beyond the center frequency of those notes, there's harmonics either side. So I want to get down as low as I can get down, close to that 20. Your hearing threshold is down here about 20 cycles. I want to get way down there as low as I can get. So my sealed alignment can't get me there. Now, some folks like the sealed alignment, and they like that moderate roll-off. I don't. So I want the vented alignment. And so my vented alignment then will give me a flat response down, and now my 3 dB point is down around 30 cycles. It doesn't show that exactly here in my graph, but that's what I intended to show here, that it's about 30 cycles, I think, is my 3 dB down point. It's called F3, and the F3 is at about 30 cycles in that ballpark. That's what I'm targeting. With a 12-inch driver and a very large box, I can get down maybe a little bit lower than that, but not this low. Now, the other thing I'll show you in this graph is that if you try to push that envelope a little further and get down an even lower F3, what you end up happening is creating this unnatural bump here down at the bottom end, and you don't really want that. It'll produce that boominess, and we don't want boominess in there. So that's kind of the parameters around the different kinds of alignments at the bass end. I would say one other thing then that I talk about in the truck speakers video. If you have a vehicle that you put your bass driver in, the small cabin of a vehicle, be it a car or a truck, will produce an unnatural boosting, kind of like what I showed here, below 50 cycles. And so if you have a sealed alignment in that case that's already dropping below 50 cycles, that can compensate nicely for the unnatural boosting that the cabin produces. Hence, you get a relatively flat response, more like this one. And so that's the one situation in which sealed alignment actually works well. And I have a speaker system in my vehicle, in my truck, in which I do that. I use a sealed alignment system, and I'm listening to jazz music with 5-string bass and all that. And I do get, it's a different characteristic than the vented alignment that I have at home, but you do get relatively flat response, and that's the whole point. So the characteristic notwithstanding, it is a flat response, and that's preferable in the vehicle. Whereas when I had vented boxes in the cabin of my truck, I was getting an unnatural boosting, and it sounded very boomy, so it was not effective. So I've been talking about the effectiveness of a vented alignment for a bass driver because I want that lower F3, that point down where 3 dB down. I want to get it down as far as I can get it down to. I'd like to get it down to 20 cycles, but I haven't found a system where I can do that without enormous box sizes. And so the lowest I've been able to get is in the mid-upper 20s, which is fine because you're dropping off down below that. It's not like it's completely walled off. So that's kind of for larger bass drivers, my preference is for the vented alignment. And I would say my preference has been for large vented alignments versus small. I found my experience has been that, and again, the driver is going to dictate that, right? So if this driver dictates a 2 cubic foot box, and that's actually one alignment, as again I showed in the graph, if I were to go to larger boxes, I would get that unnatural bump as I would get an even lower F3. But in this case, I can get a nice smooth roll-off all the way down to about 30 cycles at F3. But it requires a big box. Now, 2 cubic feet for this 10-inch driver is awfully big for a 10-inch. But I think that that's perfect. I don't mind the large boxes. I love the characteristics of the large vented alignment. For my 12-inch driver, I'm running a 3 cubic foot box, which is really monstrous, and I have 2 of them. And if you see my top of the mountain video, you see those 2 in there. Takes up an awful lot of room, and so you have to be prepared for that for the sizes of the boxes to get the large vented alignments. And one of the challenges that folks have in listening to vented alignments in bass drivers is oftentimes with manufactured speakers. There are 2 problems with them, at least 2. There may be others, but there are at least 2 problems with manufactured bass speakers. The first problem is they're often, if they are vented, they might be sealed, and I've never liked the sound of sealed systems. But if they are vented, they may be vented in a very small box, and that really constrains the driver's ability to really breathe and work. And you don't get as low an F3, and it just has a stuffed characteristic to it. That's not pleasing to my ears. I don't know of any manufacturer that's ever produced a large vented alignment, for example, a 10-inch driver with a 2 cubic foot box. I think it looks, the driver looks awfully small, the box looks awfully big, and I think manufacturers aren't willing to put that in a showroom. Everybody will reject it. That box is too big. I don't want to put that big a box in my living room. The box looks so big, the driver looks so small. Why is there such a small driver in there? That kind of mentality that it comes from a lack of experience with it. Once I've experienced large vented alignments, I am totally sold on them, and that's all I'll do. So, but unfortunately, it's hard to argue that point because no one's heard it. Unless you build yourself, you won't ever hear that. So that's just a little plug on large vented alignments and why I like the vented alignments, because they're large. The other issue I wanted to also mention was that very often, I think so, virtually exclusively, the bass drivers in subwoofers that are manufactured are being put into cube-shaped boxes. And so I did this last summer, built a cube box and put the driver right in the center of the front panel, which is the absolutely worst possible thing you could do, and demonstrated by listening to that driver box against the exact same size box. I think it was these drivers. That's why these are all soldered up, because I was using these drivers for that testing. And I compared it to a 5-sided box that I have a pair of those built for these drivers. And the 5-sided sounded so much better. The boominess of the cube box was very apparent. Not to all recordings. It was not that dramatic as I expected, but there was a boominess. If you listen to enough recordings where you get that certain boominess frequency was apparent in the recording, that's when you heard the boominess. It's definitely there. So cube shapes just are terrible, and that's all you ever see. And small vented is terrible, and that's all you ever see. So if you're opposed to vented alignments for bass driver systems outside of the vehicle, if you're talking the home, if you've not heard large vented alignments, then you've not heard vented bass done well. So that's my plug there. Now, about mid-range drivers, there's an issue of whether because a mid-range driver is like a bass driver, it also needs to be in a box, and it also needs to have an alignment. And so which should I choose, vented or sealed? Now, because this mid-range driver is not going to be used for bass, I'm not going to try to produce, I'm adding a bass driver, I'm going to add 2 of these for this system, but I could add just 1, right, for a subwoofer, single subwoofer. But in any case, because this mid-range driver being small, it's only really designed to produce the mid-frequencies all the way up to 4,000, so I can cross it easily with a tweeter, but then all the way down to, it'll only do about 50 cycles, even in a vented alignment. But now in this case, because this mid-range driver is going to be mated with a bass driver that's going to handle everything 100 cycles down, this mid-range driver does not need to produce anything below 100 cycles. So it would be nice, actually, be ideal to place this into a sealed alignment and have that that little bit higher F3 cutoff of about 100 cycles. That would be ideal. If I could put this in a sealed alignment, and that's exactly what I've done here. This box is designed for this driver to produce an F3 of about 100 cycles. So this driver will go flat then down to about 100, and then at that point be dropping off. And of course, the bass system is going to take up the task at that frequency level and on down. So I really don't want a vented alignment. The guys at Matasound also tell me that if this were in a vented box, the bass from the bass driver could be producing waves inside the vent, actually going into the vent and interfering with this driver in this system. So being in a sealed system, it's acoustically completely isolated from the bass waves in the room. And so that's also another reason for having vented. And the third issue about a vented alignment, I didn't perhaps mention this before, but the vented alignment box generally calls for much smaller internal volume than the sealed alignment calls for a much smaller box than the vented alignment. And so that's the advantage of the sealed alignment, that small box. But I think the sacrifice in frequency, F3 down point, is unacceptable for bass drivers. But now perfect for mid-range drivers. So I want that 100 cycle F3. And the other advantage, as I said, is it's a very small box, and that's ideal for a satellite. I don't want a big box. In fact, this box, being a 5-sided, ended up with too much internal volume. And actually, if you can see it in the video, I added a couple of little panels in here and I intended to have this as a kind of a peak to offset the parallel top and bottom panels. But in any case, it takes up some of that internal volume because I don't need the degree of internal volume of a five-sided box yields, as opposed to a square box or something, rectangular box. But in any case, the sealed alignment being both giving me the higher F3 of 100 cycles in this case, and the smaller internal volume size, both work advantageously for me in building satellite boxes. And the base will take up the difference. Now, if you buy a mid-range driver and it happens to have a sealed alignment F3 of 150 cycles, as some do, well, that's not going to work if you're going to cross your system over at 100 cycles. This is an active system, so I'm having an active electronic crossover. But if I wanted to get down 100 cycles as the target is here, I can't have my mid-range driver dropping off below 150. I would end up with a hole there between 100 and 150. So I needed this, and fortunately this driver does have a 100 cycle F3 in a sealed box. And so, in fact, this box is fairly large for the sealed is even smaller, but because of the five-sided shape, it ended up with more volume than I wanted. But it would be a very small box if it were rectangular, which would be okay too. I don't have to have a five-sided box for the mid-range driver. I'm being picky here, and really, I just love the five-sided shape and the look, and the performance of it especially. But in any case, so you have to make sure when if you're going to build a satellite subwoofer system, and your subwoofer is going to do everything from 100 cycles down, and you want to use a sealed alignment, you have to make sure that your sealed alignment parameter will bring you down to 100 cycles. And there are some drivers that don't. They only get me to 125 or 150. And then they're dropping off below that, and I'm going to end up with that hole. Or you just cross the base driver a little higher, which is the alternative. So hope that all helps. That's about all I have for sealed versus vented. So opportunities to use vented alignment, I think, are ideal for bass speakers going all the way down to the lowest possible frequencies. And then sealed alignment is ideal for satellite speakers. And again, of course, sealed alignment is great in a vehicle, a bass system in a vehicle, although I understand most of the guys putting bass speakers in their cars, they actually like the boominess. And in fact, the stuff they're listening to is all boom, boom. And so it is all boom. So what difference? You're not listening to jazz with 5-string players and stuff, and so they don't care. But because I'm listening to jazz, I want to hear flat response all the way down. So I use sealed alignment in the vehicle and vented alignment at home for bass, and then sealed alignment in this case for satellites. Hope that all helps, and feel free to comment, and we'll see you all next time.